So as politicians duke it out over climate change and how to tackle it, let's get some perspective through hard data. A new survey from Abacus Data and think tank Clean Energy Canada sheds some light on what Canadians across the country want in a plan to fight climate change. And some of the results, well, they may surprise you a little bit. David Coletto is the CEO of Abacus Data and a regular contributor to Primetime Politics. David, good to see you again. And thanks for being here. So let's go through some of these numbers and always, what do we need to know about this survey?
So the survey was done at the end of April. We interviewed, it was actually quite a large sample, over 2,500 Canadians representative, conducted online, about plus or minus 2%.
Okay, let's get to the information here, some of the key findings. Let's start with what Canadians think is important in a plan to reduce emissions that cause climate change. What are Canadians telling you?
Yeah, so what we did here is we gave people a long list of things and said, which of these items that could help deal with climate change are a must-have in a political party's platform, ideally should have, or something you don't want to see there. And when we look at the long list of things that we did, the first thing to note is Canadians, generally speaking, want to see many of these things in the platforms. At the top of the list, vehicle pollution standards, investments in renewable energy, and clean tech incentives find a majority support saying it must be in a party's platform around climate change. You keep going down this list, phase out coal for power, make it easier for people to buy or use electric vehicles, expand public transit, cleaner fuel regulations. And at the bottom of the list, although sizable group of Canadians who still say they'd ideally like to at least see it in those platforms, is a price on pollution, also known as a carbon tax or a carbon price, where you see more division. 21% of Canadians say they don't want to see that in a plan, but in contrast, 34% say it's a must-have, and then you've got the 44% in the middle saying, ideally I'd like to see it, but it's not a deal breaker for me.
How do you think that informs the debate we're currently having in this country about it's very polarized? Got to have a price on carbon. Yep. Don't need to have a price on carbon. There's other ways of doing things.
I think it's almost in some ways the whole debate around action on climate change has centered around a carbon price. And when you look at that list, the only one that has significant opposition is the one that we've been debating and has actually become politicized, right? I don't think most of those other items on that list, whether you're a conservative, a liberal, or a New Democrat or a Green Party supporter, you think they're good ideas. It's only when it comes down to the price on carbon that we see far more division, not only regionally, but also politically.
And then you ask people to kind of fine-tune those choices, sort of narrow them down from that large group you had to really rank the most important. What did you see there?
So we asked people to pick 3 of those lists that they'd most want to see. And the first point is, when you look at this list, no one item is a consensus choice, right? Which I think is indicative of the challenge that politicians, policymakers, anyone trying to communicate and persuade the public on what the best way forward is that Canadians themselves don't see one particular item. In fact, you look at this number and you say, okay, well, at the top of the list, invest in renewable energy, clean tech incentives, vehicle pollution standards. Those were the ones that were on the first list that we showed. But even there, you're only getting just over a quarter or maybe 3 out of 10 Canadians putting it in their top 3. If you look at what's at the bottom of the list, a price on pollution, clean fuel regulations, this all points to, I think, some confusion on the part of Canadians because, to your point earlier, so much of the debate has been around the price on carbon or pollution, the carbon tax, that the rest of the actions that we could take to deal with climate change aren't being discussed. And so people, I think the public, don't have really clear ideas on what actual solutions might be. And so their answer is, I like the sounds of some of these things. I like what these might do, but there's no one obvious one, which, if you're a political party trying to figure out how do you mobilize people around an idea, that also suggests it's perhaps a little more difficult than might meet the eye.
We've seen the political debate in this country, we touched on it, really being framed as a battle between progressives on one side and largely conservatives on the other side, and never those twain shall meet, right? This survey suggests something different. What did you find when you sort of looked at the numbers and conservative voters versus other Canadians and what should be in a climate plan?
Yeah, so when we look at the political divide first, as you said, it seems like this issue is partisan, right? That if you're a conservative-oriented voter, you don't want action on climate change. But what we see here is, yes, conservatives across the board are less likely to say these items should definitely be in a climate plan. But there's a sizable portion of these are people who said they would vote conservative in an election we're held today, who say, no, Vehicle pollution standards, that's a must-have. Invest in renewables, that's a must-have. Phase out coal for power, a third of Conservative supporters say that's a must-have. This all points to, I think, the myth that Conservatives don't care about the environment, that Conservative voters don't want their political leaders to talk about this, only when it comes to price on pollution.
At the very end there, you see
right, which is that ultimate partisan issue now, where you find more division. But even there, you've got a majority of Conservative supporters saying, well, ideally a plan should have a price on pollution. I may not like the carbon tax, maybe I like a carbon cap and trade, there's different plans. But it's not black and white. It's not as black and white as perhaps the debate in Parliament might make you think.
And we've also seen, had lots of conversation around what people are thinking in Alberta and their views of climate change plans, right? What are they saying when you compare the views of Albertans to what other Canadians want to see in a climate plan?
We've
found this interesting.
Yeah, we've isolated Albertans not for any other reason
not
other
to
than
pick on Albertans.
Yeah, but in other surveys we've done, we've seen some variation, right? Albertans are typically less concerned about climate change. They view the issue very differently because of the importance of the oil and gas sector to that province. But despite that, we still see not as big a gap in public opinion between Albertans and the rest of Canada on these issues, right? So on some things, we're almost in complete agreement. Vehicle pollution standards, investments in renewables, clean tech initiatives, these are all things that if a party put them in their platform, Canadians from coast to coast to coast would say, I like that, it's a good idea, right? If we go to the next slide and we look at some of the areas where there's a little more division, price on pollution, a little larger gap as we would expect given that there's more Conservatives in Alberta. But even in Alberta, where the last provincial election was fought around whether Jason Kenney, the new premier, was going to get rid of their provincial carbon tax, you see there a third of Albertans, about 3 out of 10, say it's a must-have, and another 40% say, well, ideally it should be in the plan. That gap between Canadians and Albertans isn't as big again as we suspect. So I think the point here is environmental policy towards climate change often gets quite divisive, and the rhetoric has kind of heated up, right? Whether we're talking about pieces of legislation or broader policy. But at the end of the day, I think there's broad recognition from all Canadians that climate change is a challenge, is a crisis. Mm-hmm. We've seen that rise. And so what we were trying to do with this survey with Clean Energy Canada is identify those areas of common ground. And on most areas, there's quite a bit of common ground on how to do something. And so that now requires, I think, political leadership, perhaps, to find more common ground. And the public's already maybe ahead of the politicians a little bit on this.
All right. David Coletto, as always, thanks.
Thanks, Peter.